Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020, and this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on. So today is the big No Kings demonstrations again. I hope you participated, or maybe on the West Coast or Hawaii you're going to. There are anti-fascist demonstrations all over the world today. One that I found particularly good was one conducted by Ukrainians and East Europeans in London, who marched against Putin, Trump, Netanyahu, and Farage. And we'll put a link to the call to that demonstration and pictures from it, because London is, 4 or 5 hours ahead of us. So they already got the pictures out on a Twitter page. So take a look at that. And if you miss this one, or you're not going, you can see the kind of thing you're missing. It's really important. Now, of course, Indivisible, which is the prime mover in these No Kings demonstrations, their agenda is to mobilize the Democratic votes for the fall. But the format of these demonstrations is wide open. We can bring our own signs, slogans, and leaflets, and can talk to people who are progressive and peace-minded at these demonstrations, and hopefully recruit those who are ready for an independent eco-socialist alternative that can beat both the neo-fascist Republicans and the neoliberal Democrats. So, if you didn't participate, too bad. If you're going out, good, but we shouldn't let these opportunities pass. So the big news dominating us the last week is this stupid war on Iran. And, speaking of the Democrats, their leaders in Congress, Schumer and Jeffries, have delayed further votes on war powers resolutions until April. These votes could stop the war on Iran, make it illegal for Trump to continue, but they're waiting. And, what the hell are they thinking? Trump is a clown. Him and his whole stupid team, they're surprised that the Iranians have closed the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 20% of the world's oil and gas transit. And that's even though their intelligence and military experts told them this could happen. And now they're compelled to do some kind of ground invasion with substantial casualties likely to try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And in the process, they're wrecking the world economy with the oil price shock and just the world shock at the incompetence of American leadership. So, even the status of the dollar as the reserve currency is in question now. And if it loses that status, that's why we've been able to run such overwhelming debts. I think it's 37 trillion in the federal government now. If they lose trust in the dollar as a reserve currency, we will have to pay that debt back in devalued dollars, which is going to bankrupt this country, plunge us into austerity, drive us into a depression that the world maybe hasn't seen since the Soviet Union broke up and East Europe crashed. So he's bankrupt in the US. And then he's a damn idiot. Iranian drones cost about $50,000 each, and they're firing them at US bases, Israel, and the Gulf states. And the US and the Gulf states are trying to intercept these drones with $4 million Patriot missiles and $14 million THAAD missiles. $50,000 versus millions. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians can do it with $1,000 interceptor drones. They're part of a layered system. It requires radar detection, machine gun fire, and other things. But the Ukrainians have learned how to do it because the Russians have been throwing these Shahed drones at them, for 4 years now. And Ukraine offered these interceptor drones to the U.S. in return for Patriot missiles, which they desperately need to shoot down Russian ballistic and cruise missiles fired at them. But Trump, genius that he is, petty tyrant that he is, said, no, the U.S. has the best drones in the world. We don't need Ukraine's help. And of course, that was another lying boast by Trump that nobody but suckers believe. But, that's what we got for leadership. And the world is taking note. And that's why the U.S. is becoming isolated, doesn't have allies, and even the dollar as the reserve currency is now in jeopardy. And so Trump's got himself into another endless war. He can't declare victory with the Strait of Hormuz closed. And if he did, Netanyahu would keep bombing Iran. And Iran would fire back at U.S. bases in the region because the U.S. is supplying Israel with bombs. They just sent a whole nother, or about to send a whole nother shipment of bombs and other weaponry. So Iran knows that when Israel shoots at them, the U.S. has backed them up. So U.S. bases become legitimate targets. And if U.S. bases are attacked, Trump just can't ignore that. So he can't get out of this thing. So, what we got to do is pressure Congress. We got to pressure them to pass a war powers resolution to stop Trump. There's a supplemental coming up, could be as much as $200 billion, because even though the Pentagon budget's over $900 billion, they don't budget for wars. So they got to ask for more money. So we got to defeat that supplemental, which will be coming up soon. In the meantime, we need to build out the Green Party base so we can replace the feckless corporate Democrats who can't stop this craziness with a real opposition that can defeat Republican neo-fascism. And this war has had a big impact on the war in Ukraine. Reports are out there that the U.S. is running out of Patriot missiles and other weaponry it needs in the Middle East. And so it's diverting weaponry intended for Ukraine, even some that's already been bought by Europeans to pass on to Ukraine, to the wars in the Middle East. So Trump may say that the U.S. doesn't need the Ukrainian help in defending against Iranian drones and missiles in the Middle East, but he is actually taking what the Ukrainians were supposed to get to fight that war, and the U.S. is running out of weapons. And increasingly, Ukraine doesn't need U.S. support. I mean, they've seen the handwriting on the wall. They're producing about 60% of the weapons they use, and they're destroying Russia's ability to export oil. And oil exports or oil revenues have accounted for 30 to 50% of Russia's state revenues over the last decade. And Russia's military budget is 40% of its national budget. So what does that mean? It means that oil and gas exports fund Russia's war machine. And Russia was in real trouble. Their revenues from oil and gas exports were down 50% last year. And only this war with the jack up in oil prices has begun to refill their coffers. But the Ukrainians have responded to that. Earlier this week, they had several major drone attacks on Russia's Baltic Sea ports. And Reuters estimates that Russia lost 40% of its oil exporting capacity in these strikes, which really hurts Russia's ability to, make money off these off oil and gas exports. And meanwhile, Russia's started the spring offensive, and Ukraine is devastating them. Russia's lost 10,000 soldiers in the first week of the offensive. So, this narrative that Russia's going to inevitably win just doesn't hold up. I mean, Russia's been attacking Ukraine for longer than it took the Soviet Union to push Hitler's army back to Berlin during World War II. And Ukrainians were a disproportionate share of the Red Army that defeated Hitler. Now Ukrainians are defeating Putin's imperial plans. Another statistic, in 3 years of constant offensives against Ukraine, 23, 24, and 25, Ukraine gained only 1.5% of Ukrainian land. And last month in February, actually Ukraine was taking back land that the Russians had occupied. It's not major, but it's enough to halt the Russian offensive. And the cost of getting that 1.5% of Ukrainian land was over 1 million casualties to the Russians. So like Vietnam, don't underestimate the strength and resilience of a people fighting for their own land and people. Unfortunately, this war is going to continue. Putin can't stop any more than Trump can. He's going to lose face politically, domestically. People are going to wonder what the war was for. What's he going to do with all these veterans coming back, wondering what the hell they fought for? Russia is not in the best financial situation. How are they going to take care of those veterans? It could create a volatile situation. And the U.S. mediated so-called peace negotiations are a farce. I mean, basically, Witkoff and Kushner know nothing about Russia and Ukraine, and basically buy the Russian narratives, and Witkoff comes back and repeats them. And right now, the U.S. is pressuring Ukraine to capitulate, to give Russia more land. And that won't stop the war. I mean, it will just set up Russia for further attacks, because Putin's objective all along was to replace the Ukrainian government with a puppet government. And, that's what the Ukrainians, won't accept. So Ukraine needs our continued anti-imperialist solidarity. We need to continue to provide moral and political and material support to the Ukrainians. And when it comes to moral support, I mean, the Ukrainians really appreciate that. It just lifts their spirits to know that they're not alone against Russian barbarism. And our political support is needed to counter pro-Russian narratives. Now, strong majorities of Americans, the polls show, support Ukraine. They want military, economic, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But both the authoritarian MAGA right and the campus pseudo-left supports the fascist imperialists in Russia. And we need to counter the campus who are discrediting the left. I mean, that's our political support that we can provide. Most progressive and peace-minded people are repelled by fools who say that fascist Russia should be supported as a counter to US-led Western imperialism. Fascists are not going to defeat imperialism, Western or Russian. Defeating fascism requires an international left that undermines the roots of fascism and capitalist social and economic exploitation and inequality, which gives the fascists the field in which to mobilize around scapegoating minorities, immigrants, and leftists for the problems that capitalism produces systematically. So we need a real left, an internationalist left. And in material support, the Ukraine Solidarity Network has been doing this over the last few years. We got generators to people in cooperation with the miners and railway workers unions in 2024. In 2025, we raised money for a blood analyzer. It's got a fancier name, but it went to a hospital in Chernihiv. We did that with the nurses union. And next year, and this isn't up on our website yet, but it will be soon, we're going to be raising money for a center for rehabilitation for physical and mental health recovery from war injuries. And they will treat everybody from children to seniors and soldiers. And again, we're doing that with the nurses union, Be Like We Are. So there's plenty to do on that front. And it's part of the struggle against imperialism. We need to oppose Russian imperialism in Ukraine like we opposed US and Israeli imperialism against the Palestinians, the Iranians, and the Lebanese, and the Syrians. And who knows who's next. Last thing I'll bring up, you may have heard of, is that the Green candidate for governor in California, Butch Ware, got disqualified from the ballot by the California Secretary of State last week, a Democrat, who claimed he had not filed full financial disclosure reports. Now, Ware said he did, and that he, filed corrections. And then the Secretary of State, 10 minutes before the deadline, told him he had to file more corrections, and then ruled him off the ballot. So Ware sued, but unfortunately a judge yesterday sided with the Secretary of State. And Ware's saying he's going to appeal the ruling. And, I wish him the best. He said if he doesn't win the appeal, he's going to try to beat the other candidates. Or he said he would beat the other candidates in the top two primary with a write-in vote. That's obviously a long shot. That's not what we want. We got to be on a ballot. And the fact that you can't get on a ballot in this country is a travesty in a country that, tries to portray itself as the model of democracy. And the Democrats, obviously Trump is undermining democracy. He's going after voting rights now. He's trying to mess with the 2026 midterm elections. But the Democrats, they got their problems too. And this is an example. We had examples of getting knocked off the ballot in 2020. Here in New York, an independent third-party candidate just can't get on a ballot unless you get 45,000 signatures in 42 days, which, Bobby Kennedy spent $1 million. He couldn't do it. Jill Stein spent $1 million. She couldn't do it. So New York was the only state in the union that only had Trump and Harris on the ballot in 2024. And, 42,000 signatures in 42 days is 3 times harder than it is to get on a ballot in Putin's Russia from an oblast or republic, where it's 15,000 signatures in 45 days. So they get 3 more days. The old New York standard was 15,000 in 42 days. And the Greens did that, several times. It wasn't easy, but, and they hardly ever do it in Russia because it is pretty hard. So, New York is 3 times harder to get on a ballot than Putin's Russia. It's a travesty. And then you got the top 2 primary system in California. Now, Butch Ware was at 2% in a poll. The leading Democrats, there were like 8 or 9 or 10 of them. The leaders are barely at 10%. And there are 2 Republicans running. They're both around 15%. So the end result could be 2 Republicans running for governor in the general election on a ballot. When California voters are 2/3 Democratic or Democratic leaning. It's just a ridiculous system. And the Democrats, voted for this system to get it in there. So they made their bed and now they may have to sleep in it. And while there'll be a strongly Democratic legislature, there may be a Republican governor in California. It'll be a damn mess. Now, the Greens with the Peace and Freedom Party and Libertarian parties have filed a lawsuit against the top 2 system on a number of grounds, starting with, constitutional right to free expression. If you can't get on the ballot and express your views, your constitutional right is being denied. And that lawsuit was filed 2 years ago in 2024, and they still haven't had hearings on it. The briefs have been filed, and I don't know all the details, but the judge has postponed it. So it's not likely they'll get relief from that top 2 system this year. So, it's a big mess. So we're fighting here for basic democracy as well as against these wars, the climate crisis, the growing inequality, affordability crisis. I mean, we got so much on our table and we can't rely on the Democrats. That's why we need the Green Party. So I'll stop there and see what your comments and questions are. Calvin Stevens. California has awful ballot laws. Our current governor, Newsom, has been scared of Greens since Matt Gonzalez, and he's scared again. I hope Ware wins. Gruesome Newsom is awful. Yeah, for people who don't know, Matt Gonzalez, I think it was 2002, maybe 2003 or 2001, was a Green candidate for mayor. And I don't know if it's a runoff system there, but anyway, in the end, it was him versus Newsom. And the Republicans and the Democrats coalesced around Newsom. And, all the big Democrats like Jesse Jackson came in and, campaigned for Newsom, who comes out of the real estate industry. He's a rich guy. He opposes the wealth tax, which is very popular in California now. And Matt won on election day when the votes of people who voted in polling places were counted. But then when they counted the paper ballots that were submitted, somehow Newsom jumped ahead of Matt Gonzalez. And I've always wondered, with the Democrats and Republicans controlling the machinery of elections and the counting of ballots, I wonder if they didn't stuff those paper ballots to make sure that Matt Gonzalez was beat. But in the end, he did lose, and Newsom became mayor. This is of San Francisco. And so that's why Newsom has been scared of the Greens since Matt Gonzalez ran. And I think that's a big explanation as to why the Democrats are afraid of ranked choice voting and particularly proportional representation, because they know that a lot of their voting base would prefer the programs and policies that the Green Party advocates to what the Democrats advocate, and even more importantly, what they do. So, yeah, ballot access in this country is just, off the charts in terms of international standards of democracy. And it doesn't get enough attention. I mean, the media, they talk about the horse race and who's got the money and focus on the major candidates, and they're ignorant, for the most part, of what the Greens face and what the public really wants, which, if you look at the public opinion polls, they're with us on the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, deep cuts in military spending, and so many other policies. So we just need to keep fighting and fight for ballot access and keep getting out there. No, don't be discouraged by this, these games that they're apparently playing with Butch Ware. They played them with me. They played them with the other Green candidates. But, we're not going to stop. B.D. Dimmitt. Here's the link to the filing that was rejected. That's the Butch Ware. Is the link to the, ballotaccess.org. Scrolling down to factual allegations section for a blow-by-blow of went-on surrounding acceptability or not of his filing for the ballot. Yeah, so there you can get the details. And I haven't read that. That, it sounds like, is the decision, not, or maybe it's the filing of the brief that the Ware campaign put in. In any case, that resource is there, and take a look if you want to know the dirty details. Calvin Stevens. My dad works in the solar industry. Newsom cut solar funding and green energy funding. This caused my dad to immediately get laid off and lose his job of 10 years. Yeah, Newsom is terrible on energy. He's he reneged on an agreement to shut down the Diablo Canyon nuclear reactors, which, as they get older, become more dangerous, put all of Los Angeles in jeopardy. And then, cut solar funding. He's a typical corporate Democrat. They are barely lesser evil than somebody like Trump. He's against the wealth tax, which is very popular in California and could fund a lot of, needed programs and provide tax relief to people lower down the income scale. B.D. Dimmitt. Did Janet Yellen have the right to withhold the matching funds for Jill and for Mike Pence when they were the only two candidates who were eligible for funding from the presidential, what does that stand for? Election Campaign Fund? My question is based on the wording saying that she had to determine that there wasn't or might not be enough in the fund for all candidates who were eligible at the time to receive the full amount. In order to be eligible for any of that fund, a campaign has to already have agreed to accept the spending limits. Pence, I guess this continues. Well, technically, Yellen had the right. She was the Treasury Secretary. The Democrats and Republicans had drained the fund, and they put it into actually, good programs about election protection. But they shouldn't have taken the money from there. Should have taxed the rich or cut the military budget for those funds. So when Jill and Mike Pence applied for the funding, Yellen said, well, she had to wait to see if Trump or Harris would take the public funding they were entitled to, which I forget the number, but it was like $100 million, a little over $100 million in public funding between Labor Day and the election, which of course Harris and Trump were never going to do. They had billionaires backing them. 100 million is, change lost in the couch compared to the amount of money they spent on that election. So, of course, Yellen knew they would never ask for that money. But, technically, she had the legal right to wait. And, I think the original sin here is that the Democrats and Republicans have drained that fund. So when it came to this situation, there wasn't enough money in it for the money it should have provided. So again, the public, and then, in the lead up to that election, the Democrats had a bill, H.R. 1, which was a pro-democracy bill, except when it came to the presidential, and a couple other things, but the presidential campaign fund, they wanted to eliminate it and set up a matching fund system for congressional candidates, which, maybe would be a good idea, but don't eliminate it from the presidential campaign. This fund was originally set up in the post-Watergate reforms after Nixon, was taking bags of money and cash money and doing all kinds of funky things, financing his campaign and spending it on, criminal enterprises like the Watergate break-in. They've just totally eviscerated it. And it's among the many things that since those reforms in, I think, past 1975 or 4, probably 5, you've had court decisions that have eviscerated the ability of the federal government to regulate campaign finance, in addition to the defunding of the, public funding for presidential campaigns. So, it's one of those things. That's why, one of the reasons why, if you look at these international studies or rankings of democracy, the U.S. is backsliding on democracy like a lot of countries these days. And, the Democrats ain't doing anything about it, really. I mean, Mark Elias is out there trying to protect voting rights, and he's pretty good at that, but then he turns around and he's got an army of lawyers that attack our presidential candidates getting on the ballot. He did it to me. He did it to Jill, or his network of lawyers did. So he's a hypocrite on that account. Again, that's why, if progressives rely on the Democrats to make things better, all they're going to get is a status quo. It's already terrible. And the only thing you can say for the Democrats is they're status quo. They're not hard right reactionaries taking us toward fascism like Trump is. But the Democrats don't fight it very well. I think of Biden. He kept pushing bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow his election in 2020. I mean, that's not fighting the fascists. That's trying to negotiate and compromise with them, which just strengthens the fascist movement. We need an independent working class movement that speaks for itself, organizes for itself, puts its own candidates up, and starts beating both the neoliberal Democrats and the neo-fascist Republicans. Okay, BD adds, Pence qualified for $1.5 million. Jill was initially due under $300,000. Yeah, so I don't know Pence's campaign finances, but the fact that he applied, which most major party candidates have not been doing in recent presidential election cycles, shows that he needed that $1.5 million. And of course, Jill, I think I can't remember what she raised, like $1.5 million, maybe. 300,000 would have helped a lot. And when it was needed was when we were paying petitioners to get on the ballot. And so by delaying, you can only use this money in the presidential primary matching funds. And what we use them for, the primary for us, is getting on the damn ballot in most cases. So if the money comes after that's over, you can't even really use it unless you go into debt and then pay people back afterwards, which is what my campaign tried to do. And we ended up not being able to pay people who agreed to, how do we put it, agreed to do the work and they would get paid if we got the matching funds. And we were denied for technical reasons. We had enough money. They treated us very badly. They asked for a lot of details that were not required, and it just drew out the process. And in the end, they rejected. So it's a tough system to work in, but that's where we are. We gotta fight anyway. Calvin Stevens, is there any hope for the Green Party to stop embracing campism in Russia? I still don't publicly say I'm green because people assume you love Russia when you say that. Yeah, that's what I said earlier about these campists discrediting the left. Most progressives, they don't want to have anything to do with, defending or apologizing for Putin, or take Iran. We should say the U.S. should not be attacking Iran, but we shouldn't be defending the clerical fascists that run Iran. Let the Iranian people take care of those fascists, but our bombs are not helping in that struggle. The opposition can't organize when they're getting bombed. And in fact, the regime has more excuse for repression and can blame the opposition for opening up Iran to attack, or at least that's what they'll say. So is there any hope for the Green Party? Yeah, I've in fighting this fight on the question of international solidarity, anti-imperialist, consistent anti-imperialism, and supporting Ukraine and opposing Russia's invasion, I'm winning over more people all the time in the Green Party, one by one. I mean, there's some people who are looking for simple answers that are always applicable, so they don't have to stop and think and look at the actual facts on the ground. So yeah, U.S. imperialism has been vicious, from Vietnam to Iraq. And so if you say, well, whatever the U.S. is doing, we'll do the opposite, you're going to be right a lot of the times, but not necessarily every time. So, we got to look at the facts on the ground, and we got to be working with our comrades in these countries, the progressives, the trade unionists, the socialists, the anarchists, the Greens, the feminists, the environmentalists, and see what they want. And if you do that with Ukrainians, they want military aid to stop the Russians. They want humanitarian aid to repair the damage that's been done. They want economic aid so the Ukrainian state can at least, pay for public schools and healthcare and pensions. And so that's what we need to be supporting. Anthony, we should gather all of these so-called Russia-loving Greens in one place and have a conversation with them. Dialogue is important in the Green Party. Yeah, that's a problem because the two sides are kind of in their own silos, except on the national committee lists, where there's been an ongoing debate. And in fact, the only time I know of where we had a debate, is when I debated Matthew Ho and Margaret Kimberly. And that was back in early 2023. The Green Socialist Organizing Project organized that. And, it's the only time where we've, confronted each other face to face. I guess the other time was the East Bay, Alameda County Greens had a forum on Ukraine. I was initially invited, and then the campus and that group wanted Jill Stein on there. So we had a debate. So we've had a couple, but, the conversation should be, that's another problem with the Greens. We don't have formats for that. The Green Party has a publication, Green Line, which is more a rah-rah, cheer the Greens kind of publication. The national committee lists are not open to all Greens, although now that they've gone to base camp, I think a lot of Greens are on that list that aren't on the national committee on the base camp, and it has different, I don't know what you call them. They're like rooms or topics. So, that may be opening it up a little bit, but I'm not sure how many Greens are aware of that or participating. And then we started New Green Horizons to be a online publication where these kind of things can be debated. So we need to encourage those debates. And, I mean, how can the campus hold to this position that they call it a proxy war, with the U.S. presumably using the Ukrainians to attack Russia and Russia defending itself? But now Putin and Trump are on the same side. So who the hell are the Ukrainians fighting? Who are they a proxy for? Of course, they're fighting for themselves against both now, Trump and Putin. So, yeah, that's something that the campus need to. They're in a contradiction, and I haven't seen any of them explain it away, because they can't. If the Ukrainians are fighting for themselves, they're not fighting as proxies for anybody else. Kevin Rosa, with TSA funding currently an issue, do you think the Green Party should push for the agency's abolition? This seems like a good opportunity to dismantle the post 9/11 police state Bush created. That's a good question. I agree with the general, dismantling the police state that Bush created. And TSA, I'd have to study that a little bit. I think most people now feel a little bit reassured that TSA is checking for people carrying guns and things like that. But on the other hand, I haven't seen a study as to whether it's actually prevented, something bad from happening. I know here in the local airport, every few months, somebody's got a damn gun in their luggage, and they usually say, "Oh, I forgot." But so I don't know about TSA in particular, but in general, yeah, the police state we're building, particularly now ICE and Border Patrol. I mean, I'm clear on that. Both of them need to be dismantled, and the people that have been the agents need to be monitored so they don't get recruited into right-wing militias that can cause mayhem in other ways. And we need a new agency dealing with immigration and citizenship that helps people who want to come to the country get integrated, situated, and get legal status. And that's not what ICE or Border Patrol do. Chris Blankenhorn, unpaid TSA agents don't seem to be too happy with highly paid ICE agents standing around openly carrying rifles while not helping alleviate lines. Yeah, I'd be pretty angry as a TSA agent right now. I mean, these ICE. I read one news report, and the reporter asked the ICE agent, "What's he supposed to do there?" And he said, "I don't know." They're just they're just for show, for Trump to act like he's doing something when he's not. It's pathetic. Anthony, left-wing parties around the world are meeting at the first International Anti-Fascist Conference in Porto Alegre, Brazil this weekend. Yes, I'm aware of that. In fact, some people wanted to fund me to go to that conference and sort of provide, I guess, mental, if not physical, protection for 5 Ukrainians who are there. Campism is a big problem in that conference. I have got reports from a comrade in Solidarity, a socialist organization I belong to, who said in the panel Friday night, the division between the campus and the internationalists was stark. They had somebody from, he didn't say where they were from, but he said the last speaker spent his time, saying the Ukrainians were slaughtering Russians in 2014, after the Maidan revolution and the separatist military uprising, which was backed by Russia in the Donbass. And there were some very good internationalist speakers. Rafael Bernabe, who's we've had him on the podcast. He talked about Ukrainian solidarity, and I'd like to have him back to talk about the Green New Deal because he's written about that too. He was a senator in Puerto Rico with the Citizens Victory Party, and when he tried to run for re-election, the two major parties, which are kind of like the Democrats and Republicans in Puerto Rico, did this lawfare thing, because what the Citizens Victory and the Independence Party were trying to do is run a joint slate. And they filed their paperwork, and the election officials controlled by these two major parties denied them access to the ballot. So Rafael is not in the Senate, but they'll probably get back on the ballot next election. Anyway, he gave a great speech. There was a guy from India. I think his first name is Shushan, but anyway, his name, both first and last names start with an S. He was apparently good. And then somebody from the French organization ATTAC or ATTAC, ATTAC, you probably heard of it. But then there were other speakers, somebody from the Venezuelan government, somebody I think from the Cuban government, who, were campus and took a campus perspective. So that conference it's being debated. There are 5 Ukrainians there. They have their own workshop aside from these plenary sessions like the one I just described. I'll be very interested to see how they are received and what goes on with that. Also, there are Ksenia Kagarlitskaya, who is the daughter of Boris Kagarlitsky, who's serving a 5-year sentence in a penal colony in Russia for speaking out against the war. They said his speaking out was terrorism. Kagarlitsky is a world-renowned Marxist sociologist and political activist in Russia, who was imprisoned by the Brezhnev regime, the Yeltsin regime, and now the Putin regime. She is there with a left-wing Russian mathematician and politician named Mikhail Labanov, who was elected to the Moscow City Council. He's an independent socialist. He's not really of communist, capital C, persuasion, but that's the only way he could get on the ballot. And he got elected, apparently, to a city council until the Russian authorities showed up with the electronic vote that somehow added an impossible number of votes to his opponent. And so he lost that election. And then he spoke out against the war, got in trouble. He's now in exile. So we have those two Russian anti-war activists there as well. So I'm very keen to see how they are received and the what happens with their visit. So yeah, I'm well aware of that conference. And unfortunately, campism is a problem that's hurting the left worldwide, because most people don't want to be apologetic for authoritarian governments. A lot of them talk socialist rhetoric and pursue extremely capitalistic development paths that are extractivist. They're dependent on oil and mineral extraction. They haven't diversified. They're ecologically oblivious. And, they're backsliding on democracy. That is not what the left stands for. And, until the left is consistent in acting and speaking on its values, a lot of people are going to see that hypocrisy, and they're going to say, if that's the left, I don't want anything to do with it. So that's the problem we got. And it's, I think, maybe the most important ideological struggle we got in the international left today. In fact, I think that is the most. Until recently, the ecological question may have been it, because the old left, the old socialists, were ecologically oblivious. That's why we talk about eco-socialism today instead of just socialism. But now these international questions have come to the fore, given, the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Palestine, these wars of aggression against Iran and Lebanon. It's come to the top as a key issue the left has to address. Scott 164, any thoughts on Washington State implementing an income tax? this might be the first of states to finally get fed up with billionaires. I thought it was a wealth tax. I haven't had time to go into the details, but I know Washington State, for a state Democratic control, fairly liberal, had one of the most regressive state tax structures in the country. I thought they adopted a wealth tax, not a more progressive income tax. But the thought is, that is something Greens should be championing, progressive tax reform, because the billionaire class and the centimillionaire class and even the multimillionaire class are, they're paying lower taxes in a lot of cases than a low-income working class person, because of the way the taxes are structured. And when you add in state, local, and federal, you get a very regressive tax structure. There's an economist at UC Berkeley, Zuckman, Gabriel Zuckman, I think his name is, if I remember correctly. Google that, and you'll see some good studies on wealth inequality, income inequality, and tax reform. And he has a colleague in France, Gabriel Zuckman, and the other guy's name is blanking, but there's a lot of good material there. It's an issue, and I know when I've campaigned on it, running for governor, it was really effective, because I'm running against Cuomo, and Cuomo, he's against the wealth tax, he's against more progressive income taxes. He wants to, balance the budget by cutting aid to public schools and things like that. And I could just lay out, if we went back to the progressive income tax structure we had in the 70s, I can't remember the number, we'd have X billion more dollars of income, which would cover the deficit. And if we stopped rebating the stock transfer tax, which they've done since the fiscal crisis in New York City in the 70s, now that's generating 15 billion or more every year. And if we had a wealth tax, which we could, add billions more, New York would be able to cut, low-end taxes and fund a lot of programs that people want, from, a single-payer state healthcare system, which actually, given the administrative savings from the mess that private insurance is, would save the economy money. But, we need to build out affordable housing. We need to actually do what a climate bill passed in 2019 said we were going to do, and now Governor Hochul's pulling back from, and that is build out a clean energy system in the state. And the bill that passed in 2019 was a compromise that, the Greens had a bill, and then the Working Families Party and those folks had a bill, and Cuomo negotiated with the Working Families Party and, got them to compromise further. So even what we had in 2019 isn't what we needed. But now Hochul, Governor Kathy Hochul, is retreating from that. As, every report we get about the climate from the scientists gives us a more dire situation that we're dealing with. I mean, it's just insane. I mean, we know Trump is insane, but we have to realize people like Kathy Hochul and Gavin Newsom are damned insane when it comes to, what's happening to this world and what's happening to people. Washington State just adopted its first income tax in over a century. It's a 9.9% tax on income over 1 million. So it's both an income tax, but only for above 1 million. Well, it's still an income tax. It's not taxing assets, which, I just glanced at the headlines on this week. So, okay, it's a progressive income tax. Good. It's a tax on millionaires and people making over $1 million in a year, which is good and easy to see why most people say, yeah, do it. They don't make $1 million a year. So it's a good step in the right direction. Scott 164. Howie, regarding artificial intelligence, I don't think the issue is its existence alone, but rather how it's handled. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, believes that humans are resources and thus is hoping he can just charge people for intelligence while we get dumber. He made an awful comparison of a human spending the first 20 years of being raised and how AI gets developed, despite humans can reproduce while AI cannot. I don't know, that's something to talk about. Even if we handle AI as a system, we need to focus on the people behind it. The convenient solution is not always the best solution. Well, you said that AI can't reproduce itself. That, from what I've been reading, as AI gets more intelligent, it may start reproducing itself at the expense of humans. So, I've said, and I believe I know that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are proposing a moratorium on data centers which support AI. I think it should be on AI in general until we figure out, a regulatory regime that can protect us from what it might do to people, as well as the, big environmental costs it's imposing in terms of energy consumption and water consumption. So it's a technology that we got to step up and have a debate about what it is, and then guide its implementation. I mean, it can do amazing things, like help find cures to diseases if we use it right. But if we just let it run wild under these tech bros, we're going to have real problems. Scott 164, still, we should be wary of how people behind it are getting so divorced from reality that they're starting to see humans as not people, but resources. Yes, exactly. We can't leave AI to the tech bros. They are, they've turned out to be, at least the leading ones now, to be extreme right wingers. A lot of them, four of them in particular, are products of South Africa under apartheid, and they believe in so-called, they're racist. They're biological racists, not just cultural racists. And they think they're the superior beings, and the rest of us regular folks are Untermenschen. They are extreme. They're fascists, and we just can't let them control this technology. I'm talking about Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and a couple other guys to come out of South Africa. And, the whole culture of Silicon Valley, it was kind of liberal California until about, I don't know when, 15 years ago. And then the leadership of those companies just turned extreme right and got with Trump. It's unbelievable. Maybe they see Trump as a dummy they can manipulate. But they're with him on the anti-minority, the racist shit. It's amazing that the leadership class in this country is people from the gutters in terms of morality and humanity. There was a question pop up. I wonder what happened to it. Oh, there you go. Have you seen the deposition videos from the Doge staffers? Again, it's a headline I glanced at. I have not. So I'm sure there were a lot of revelations about what they did. I've heard a little bit about, the Social Security data maybe not being secure. So it's so much going on. That's one thing I haven't had a chance to get into. John Lindsay Green. Howie, what's your take on the issue of reparations for African Americans? Well, I mean, it's obvious. We need to make African Americans whole and repair the damage that's been done. I think where I stand on that is where the reparations movement, starting with James Foreman in the Black Manifesto, he read out at Riverside Church, and then in Cobra, National Committee on whatever it stood for, and now the National African American Reparations Commission. They all argued that it can't just be simple cash payouts, because not only were people as individuals robbed, but the whole communities were destroyed and robbed. And you can't repair that by handing out cash to individuals any more than you can, say, have climate reparations by paying out cash to individuals in the global South. There need to be institutions and programs in the case of African Americans to rebuild communities and assets and businesses. Foreman's manifesto back in that was probably 69, was he wanted, well, in this case, the churches, but the government is a logical institution to do it. Printing presses and book publishing and TV stations, in other words, communications, and then universities, and then an economic development fund and things like that. And so one of my concerns is that the reparations movement has been hijacked by people who just want cash reparations. And then they talk about lineage based. So they're just talking about African Americans who can prove that they had ancestors who were enslaved in the United States. So they're denying that people from the Caribbean states where their ancestors were enslaved should be able to get reparations. They're denying that even people who were free under slavery were damaged by slavery and what went with it, the segregation, discrimination, and violence. So it needs to be collective, as well as individual reparations may be part of it. That's what I like about the bill before Congress that John Conyers originally wrote back in the 80s. And it sets up a commission so that African Americans themselves can testify as to what kind of reparations and what form they want. And so you come up with a reparations program that's not just handing out cash, which goes into a capitalist economy, which accumulates wealth, concentrates in a few people, and actually rebuilds communities. And so anyway, yeah, reparations, before the UN, the world voted, the US didn't vote for it, but, calling for acknowledgement of what the slave era did, the slavery era did, and the need for reparations. So, to me, it's obvious. We did it to the Japanese who were interned. Germany's been doing it for the Jews who were, slaughtered in the Holocaust. It's something that has lots of precedent to it. And it's just a shame that the United States has not stepped up to deal with that question honestly. And, the Trump side, anti-woke, so-and-so people, they're claiming that white people face discrimination. When if you look at the statistics and all the civil rights cases and discrimination cases that are, brought to court, it's not white people, it's predominantly African Americans and other people of color that are racially discriminated against. So this is a problem we still haven't resolved. So, yeah, I think reparations is an important issue, and we need to be talking about it and trying to advance H.R. 40, which is the bill that I see in the chat. It says, John, oh, yeah, you're saying it. Stalled in the Judiciary Committee, and Ayanna Pressley's now carrying that bill, I guess, is the prime sponsor. So, yeah, that's an issue that Greens should be talking to their representatives. There's a campaign coming up, and even if you don't have a Green candidate in the race, you can make it an issue in the various forums, letters to the editor, go to the forums and try to get it answered, get the journalists to ask it, make it an issue. It's become an issue in a lot of states. In California, I think DC, I think Maryland. In any case, it's an issue that's getting more attention, but we have a long way to go. Calvin Stevens, I'm going to the No Kings in my area later today. I'm helping my local Green Party who got involved with it a month ago. Well, that's great. So your area, you must be on the West Coast or Hawaii, because right now it would be about 1 o'clock on the West Coast. It's 4 o'clock on the East Coast. So, that's great, Calvin. And I hope in getting involved, the Greens have their own signs and slogans and literature as well. And clipboards, sign people up if they're interested in the Greens. A QR code is good, but some of us older people, we're not into that electronic stuff. We, write it down is good. Just make sure they write legibly. If they didn't, ask them to fix it or have you write it for them. Kevin Rosa, if the Green Party can organize large-scale No Kings protests nationwide, they clearly have the tools to organize anti-war protests against Iran or a general strike, but won't. Certainly, mass anti-war protests and, indivisible, aside from the formal Democratic Party structures, could do that. And as I understand, they did put no war as one of their slogans this time. But it's not, the No Kings demos are diffuse anti-Trump, anti-fascist demonstrations. They don't make particular demands on the government. What we do need is, mass demonstrations saying, out now, out of Iran, and, stop arming Israel for its imperial adventures. Adventures is too nice a word for what they're doing. Again, that's, the Democrats and their funders, which is, the corporate elites, they're not interested in, certainly, the masses getting organized and out on the streets. That scares them as much as it scares Trump. Kevin Rosa, do you think Trump is serious about going after Cuba after what he's done in Iran? It seems like he's trying to regain support from the Latino community he lost due to the ICE raids. Do you really think going after Cuba would win him support in the Latino community besides exiled Cubans and maybe some Venezuelans? I don't know, but I think it probably wouldn't help him. The idea is, let the Cubans take care of Cuba, and the U.S. going in there, what are they going to set up? I mean, what they did in Venezuela wasn't regime change; it was regime capture, in my opinion. So Delcy Rodriguez is still in charge of a repressive state apparatus. Opposition is still, repressed, but she's doing Trump's bidding when it comes to oil exports and, sharing the revenues and inviting in big oil. So, that's one of the problems with these so-called anti-imperialist states. I think Cuba's one of them. 40% of their economy is controlled by the Cuban military, which buys loyalty to the Communist Party leadership. Same thing in Venezuela. I'm not sure about the percentage there, but it's clear the military is profiting from the exploitation of gold, coltan, bauxite, and other minerals in the Orinoco mining arc, where indigenous people are being displaced for either mixed state private enterprises or mining mafias linked to organized crime, which, pay the Venezuelan military for protection. And so, I remember reading an article recently about how some of these indigenous people are fighting off these mining mafias with bows and arrows. It's, that's not socialism. So one of the things you observe, and it's not just in the states that call themselves socialists, but are increasingly capitalistic and certainly authoritarian. It's in the, authoritarian states like Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps owns a lot of the Iranian economy. And being close to the state, they get favored access to contracts and finances. So that's a trend in the world, and it's linked to organized crime. A lot of these rich people, hide their money in tax havens and, do illicit things, including, drug trafficking. There's a whole power structure out there that is outside, what we would consider, democratic norms and the rule of law. So it's like the rule of rich people that control states. And, it's a big problem. In the 90s, we had an expansion of democracy, East Europe, Korea, Chile, some Latin American countries where the military dictatorships, it really expanded. And, in the last, really since about 2010, it's gone the other way, despite these mass uprisings, the Arab Spring and Occupy and a whole lot of others. The Maidan Revolution in Ukraine is one of them. Uprisings in Georgia, where they're being repressed right now. There's a lot of movement, but they're not beating the power structure, which then raises the question, how do we? And there's a book by Vincent Bevins, and I'm trying to remember the title, but he asked the question, with all these uprisings in the 2010s, how come there was no revolution? And he concludes because they were too horizontal in the point of being not really organized and having a clear program. So what that indicates is we need left-wing political parties and trade unions to provide an organizational framework for these movements that survives, when they ebb. When they flow, it gives them guidance. When they ebb, it keeps the flame alive. So, and the original question, Kevin, yeah, I think Trump he's going after Cuba. I think, Marco Rubio is certainly going to push that. Now, whether they want to go in and totally, take over the island with occupation or cut a deal like they did in Venezuela, I think they'd rather do the latter and get, a patsy in there, a puppet to, make changes that the U.S. controls. So they don't really care about democracy in Cuba. They just don't like that it's been, whatever its problems, it's been independent of U.S. domination. And that irritates the imperialists more than anything. Okay, I see the cryon up without a question, and it's after the hour. So I appreciate people coming on and having the conversation. A lot of questions, good questions and comments. I'm trying to get Brian McInnes on. He's the former Marine running for U.S. Senate from North Carolina as the Green Party candidate, who stood up in a hearing in Washington to ask the Joint Chiefs of Staff to come to their senses about this stupid war in Iran, and got his arm broken for it. So he did get back to me and said, call his campaign manager. I'm waiting for her to call me back. So hopefully we'll get him on soon. And I got some other inquiries out. So we'll see, what happens next week. But in the meantime, if you haven't gone and you still can go, get to that No Kings demo, and then stay active. And, what we do makes a difference. So everybody have a good week, and we'll see you next week.